I found out my waterfront had been sold while I was standing on it, drinking my morning coffee, watching a stranger measure my dock like he already owned the place. He smiled at me and said, "Beautiful community property." I laughed because it had to be a joke. Then he showed me the listing. The waterfront wasn't just a view. It was the reason I bought the property in the first place. A long stretch of private shoreline, a small wooden dock I rebuilt myself, and a narrow strip of land that curved around the water like it was hugging the lake. It was deeded, surveyed, fenced, and very clearly mine. Or at least it had been, until my HOA president decided reality was optional. Her name was Karen. Of course it was. She had been elected HOA president 3 years earlier after running on a platform of community harmony and shared resources. That phrase should have been my first warning. Karen believed that if something looked nice and other people wanted it, ownership was more of a suggestion than a rule. I'd had minor issues with her before. Notes about my dock being visually dominant. Complaints that my shoreline made other residents feel excluded. A suggestion, once, that I should consider opening access hours so neighbors could enjoy the water. I ignored all of it because none of it mattered. My deed mattered. My survey mattered. And I had assumed that was the end of it. I was wrong. The man on my dock introduced himself as Mark. Mid-40s, polo shirt, khaki shorts, the posture of someone who had already mentally arranged patio furniture. He wasn't rude. If anything, he was excited. He told me he was finalizing the purchase of a waterfront parcel listed by the HOA as surplus community land. He said it casually, like that explained everything. I asked him who told him it was community land. He pulled out his phone and showed me the listing. Professional photos, drone shots, a clean description talking about exclusive access to shared waterfront amenities. At the bottom, in neat text, was the seller. The HOA. My stomach dropped, but my face didn't change. Years of dealing with entitled people had taught me that panic only feeds them. I asked Mark to forward me the listing. He did, still smiling, still unaware that he was standing at the edge of a legal cliff. Karen showed up 10 minutes later. She arrived in her white SUV, parked halfway across my driveway like lines were a suggestion too, and walked toward us with a clipboard tucked under her arm. She didn't look surprised to see me. That was the moment everything clicked. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was planned. She greeted Mark first, all sunshine and authority, thanking him for coming out so early and apologizing for the confusion. Then she turned to me and her smile sharpened. She told me, calmly, that the HOA had reviewed historical usage of the waterfront and determined it qualified as a shared asset. She said it like she was announcing a bake sale. She explained that my deed didn't reflect the spirit of the community, and that the board had voted to reclassify the land. I asked her when she planned to mention this to me. She said notices had been sent. I asked her to show me one. She didn't. Mark's smile faded as he scrolled through his phone again, rereading the listing. I could see the doubt setting in. He asked Karen if there was a deed. She told him the HOA handled all that internally and that everything was in progress. That was when I stopped listening to her tone and started listening to her words. Nothing she said was real. I told Mark that the waterfront was not for sale, had never been for sale, and that I owned it outright. I told him there was a recorded survey, a clear deed, and a fence line that hadn't moved in decades. I told him he was welcome to stay and watch, but he shouldn't spend another dollar until this was resolved. Karen stepped closer, invading my space, lowering her voice like that made her powerful. She told me I was interfering with a lawful transaction. She told me she could have me fined. She told me I was embarrassing the community in front of a buyer. That was when I took my phone out and called the county clerk. I put the call on speaker. I gave them my parcel number. I asked them to confirm ownership of the waterfront strip. The woman on the line didn't hesitate. She said my name, my address, and confirmed that the land was privately owned, with no easements, no shared access, and no HOA authority. The silence after that was loud. Karen tried to recover. She said the HOA had special powers. She said community boards worked differently. She said the county was often behind on updates. Each sentence dug her deeper. Mark asked a simple question. He asked why the HOA had listed land they didn't own. Karen snapped at him. That's when her mask slipped. She told him he didn't understand community governance. She told him this was bigger than paperwork. She told him to trust her. He didn't. I told Karen to leave my property. She refused. She said she had a right to be there as HOA president. I reminded her that the HOA had no jurisdiction over my land. She laughed, a short, sharp sound that carried across the water. So I called the non-emergency number. I told dispatch that someone was trespassing, misrepresenting ownership of my property, and attempting to conduct an unauthorized real estate transaction. I gave them Karen's name. I gave them the HOA's name. I told them I had documentation ready. Karen's confidence didn't waver at first. She stood there with her arms crossed, shaking her head like I was throwing a tantrum. She told Mark this happened all the time. She told him I was one of those difficult homeowners. The patrol car arrived faster than she expected. 2 officers stepped out and listened. I showed them my deed on my phone. I showed them the survey pins along the shoreline. I showed them the listing Mark had forwarded. I stayed calm, because I didn't have to prove anything. Reality was on my side. Karen interrupted repeatedly. She insisted the HOA had authority. She insisted the buyer had rights. She insisted I was lying. One officer finally asked her if she had any documentation showing ownership. She didn't. That was when the handcuffs came out. Mark watched as they placed them on her wrists. He looked at me, then at the water, then back at her. The deal he thought he was closing evaporated in front of him, replaced by something far more memorable. As Karen was led toward the patrol car, she turned and glared at me, promising this wasn't over. She was wrong. It was just beginning. Karen's arrest didn't end the chaos. It detonated it. By the time the patrol car pulled away, the waterfront felt different, like the air itself had shifted. Mark stood there awkwardly, hands in his pockets, staring at the ripples on the water like they might explain how his weekend house hunt turned into a front-row seat to a felony. He apologized 3 times before leaving, each apology more stunned than the last. I told him he didn't need to be sorry. He'd been lied to. That mattered. What I didn't say was that this wasn't going to stop with handcuffs. I knew Karen well enough to understand one thing. She never believed she was wrong. She believed she was temporarily inconvenienced by people who didn't understand her authority. Arrest to her wasn't an ending. It was a misunderstanding she fully expected to be corrected. I spent the rest of that morning making copies, deed, surveys, tax records, old emails from the HOA where Karen complained about my waterfront being underutilized by the community. I printed everything and laid it out across my dining table like I was preparing for war, because in a way I was. By noon, my phone started buzzing. First it was a neighbor asking what happened. Then another. Then another. By the 5th call, I stopped answering and started listening to the voicemails instead. The narrative was already shifting. Karen wasn't being accused of listing my land anymore. She was being questioned. The sale wasn't fraudulent. It was premature. The HOA hadn't tried to steal anything. They were clarifying boundaries. That was when I checked my email. There it was. A message from the HOA board, sent to all residents. It claimed that due to conflicting records, the waterfront transaction had been paused and Karen had stepped aside temporarily while things were reviewed. No mention of police. No mention of cuffs. No mention of the buyer. They had turned an arrest into a clerical hiccup. I replied with one sentence. I attached the police report. The response was immediate. Not from the board, but from Karen herself. She emailed me from a personal address. The subject line read, "Let's be adult." She accused me of overreacting. She said involving law enforcement was unnecessary and hostile. She said the HOA would be seeking legal clarification and that I should be careful about making defamatory claims against elected officials. She signed it with her full name and title, like she still believed the badge meant something. I didn't reply. Instead, I drove to the county recorder's office. I wanted everything fresh, stamped, and undeniable. I asked for certified copies of my deed and the original plat map. The clerk recognized my parcel number before I finished speaking. She smiled in that way that said this wasn't the first time Karen's name had crossed her desk. She told me something quietly, leaning closer across the counter. She said the HOA had tried to file paperwork reclassifying shoreline parcels 2 weeks earlier. The request had been denied. Improper authority. Missing signatures. No legal basis. Karen had known she didn't own the land. That knowledge settled in my chest like a weight. This wasn't entitlement born of confusion. This was intentional. When I got home, there was a notice taped to my gate. HOA notice of temporary access restriction. They had the nerve to try it anyway. The paper claimed the waterfront was under review and that all private access was suspended until further notice. It wasn't signed by the board. It wasn't notarized. It was printed on cheap letterhead and taped crookedly like a threat from someone who expected compliance out of habit. I tore it down and photographed it. Then I installed a camera facing the dock. The next morning, Karen came back. No police this time. No clipboard. Just her, sunglasses on, hair pulled tight, walking like she still owned the place. She stopped at the edge of my property and announced that she was there to inspect community asset. She said it loudly, clearly performing for the 2 neighbors who had wandered over to watch. I told her to leave. She smiled and said she couldn't. She said her lawyer advised her to continue her duties. She said the arrest was being handled internally. She said I should prepare for fines. I told her I had a restraining order in progress. That wiped the smile off her face. She stepped back, visibly recalibrating, then tried a new tactic. She raised her voice and accused me of bullying the HOA. She said I was hoarding resources. She said I was hostile to community values. Each word was aimed at the audience behind her, not at me. I didn't argue. I turned my phone around and showed her the camera feed. Her face, live, standing on my land. I told her every step she took past the fence line was being recorded. She froze. Then she did something I didn't expect. She laughed. Loudly. She told me cameras didn't scare her. She told me judges respected HOA president. She told me I was about to learn how powerless I really was. That was when a second car pulled up. Not a patrol car. A black sedan. Mark stepped out. He looked uncomfortable, but determined. He said he had questions. He said his lawyer had questions. He said he wanted to understand why he'd been shown forged authority document. Karen turned on him like a switch flipped. She told him he was trespassing. She told him the deal was still valid. She told him he needed to leave before things got ugly. He asked her if she'd like to explain that to his attorney, who was on the phone. She backed away slowly. That afternoon, the HOA board called an emergency meeting. Closed session. No residents allowed. By evening, rumors were flying. Karen wasn't stepping aside anymore. She was being reviewed. The listing had been pulled. The buyer had filed a complaint. I sat on my dock as the sun went down, watching the water turn gold, knowing this wasn't about land anymore. It was about exposure. Karen had crossed a line she couldn't redraw, and the entire community was about to see exactly how far she'd gone. By the 3rd day, the story had grown legs and started running ahead of the truth. I woke up to 3 emails, 2 missed calls, and a printed flyer shoved halfway into my mailbox like someone wanted it seen but didn't want to be caught delivering it. The flyer had the HOA logo at the top and a bold headline claiming there was an ongoing dispute regarding shoreline access right. My name wasn't mentioned, but everything else was obvious. The language was careful, polished, and completely dishonest. Karen hadn't written it herself. I could tell. She was reckless when she felt powerful. This was damage control, which meant the board was scared. I read it twice, folded it neatly, and added it to the growing pile on my table. Then I checked the cameras. At 7:14 a.m., 2 people I didn't recognize walked along the edge of my property. They didn't cross the fence, but they stood there pointing, talking, gesturing toward the dock like they were discussing furniture placement. One of them took photos. They left after 5 minutes, but the message was clear. Karen might not have been welcome on my land anymore, but she was still selling the idea of it. I decided to stop reacting and start controlling the narrative. I emailed the HOA board directly, all members included. I attached certified copies of my deed, the survey, the denied reclassification request from the county, and the police report number. I asked one question. I asked them to confirm, in writing, whether the HOA claimed any ownership or access rights to my waterfront. No accusations. No emotion. Just a question they couldn't dodge without looking guilty. They didn't respond. Instead, an hour later, a contractor truck pulled up across the street. 2 men stepped out wearing reflective vests and carrying measuring equipment. They didn't approach my property at first. They stood near the road, looking back and forth between a clipboard and my shoreline. One of them raised a hand and waved when he saw me watching. I walked out to the fence. I asked who sent them. They told me they'd been hired by the HOA to assess shoreline improvements for future community use. They said it like they were reading it straight from a work order. I asked them if they'd been informed the land was private. One of them hesitated. The other said Karen told them it was being transferred. I told them to leave. They didn't argue. They packed up quickly, like men who'd realized they were standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. As they drove away, one of them shook his head. That was when my phone rang again. This time, it was the board's attorney. He introduced himself carefully, professionally, with the tone of someone stepping into a mess they hadn't created but now owned. He said the HOA was seeking clarity. He said tensions were high. He said everyone wanted a peaceful resolution. I told him peace was easy. Theft wasn't. There was a pause. Then he asked if I'd consider granting temporary access while things were reviewed. He said it would help calm the community. I laughed, and I didn't soften it. I told him the answer was no. I told him that any further attempts to access or represent my property would be treated as intentional trespass and fraud. I told him that Karen's arrest wasn't a misunderstanding and that I had no interest in pretending it was. He thanked me for my time and ended the call. That afternoon, the rumors turned sharper. A neighbor stopped me while I was checking the mail. She asked why I hated the community so much. Another asked why I wouldn't share something I wasn't using all the time. Someone else asked if it was true that my fence was illegal. Karen wasn't speaking publicly anymore, but she didn't need to. She'd trained the community to do it for her. I responded politely, calmly, the same way every time. I said the land was private. I said it wasn't for sale. I said the HOA had no rights to it. I didn't argue. I didn't explain beyond that. That restraint drove them crazy. By evening, someone posted screenshots from the old HOA website showing a vague reference to lakeside amenities. It didn't mention my parcel. It didn't show boundaries. But it was enough to muddy the water. That was when Mark called me. He sounded tired, but focused. He told me his attorney had reviewed everything. He told me the listing documentation included a forged authorization letter with Karen's signature and a fake HOA seal. He told me the brokerage was panicking. He told me the buyer disclosure violations alone were severe. He also told me something else. He said Karen had tried to salvage the deal by offering him a discount if he kept quiet. That was the moment my patience snapped into something colder. I asked him if he'd be willing to provide a statement. He didn't hesitate. He said yes. He said he was done being manipulated. He said he didn't like being made to look stupid. The next morning, A process server knocked on Karen's door. I didn't see it myself, but I heard about it from 3 different neighbors within an hour. Civil suit, fraud, misrepresentation, conspiracy. The words spread fast. Karen didn't come out that day. The HOA board sent another email that night. This one was shorter. It announced that Karen was officially suspended pending investigation. It said the board was cooperating with authorities. It said residents should refrain from speculation. No apology. No accountability. Just distance. I sat on my dock again, watching the lights reflect off the water, thinking about how close Karen had come to pulling it off. If I hadn't been home that morning. If Mark hadn't walked the property. If I hadn't challenged her immediately. She'd counted on silence. On confusion. On people not wanting to make waves. She had underestimated one thing. I wasn't just protecting land. I was protecting the truth. And the truth was about to come ashore, whether she liked it or not. Karen resurfaced the day the subpoenas went out. I didn't see her at first. I heard her. Her voice carried across the street, sharp and practiced, the sound of someone who believed volume could still bend reality. I was in my kitchen when I recognized it, that familiar tone of authority layered over panic. I stepped outside and found her standing on a neighbor's lawn, gesturing wildly while 2 board members stood stiffly beside her. She looked different. Not defeated, exactly, but thinner around the eyes. The confidence was still there, but it had edges now, like it had been worn down and sharpened by stress. She was explaining, loudly, that she had been betrayed. That the board had thrown her under the bus to protect themselves. That none of this would have happened if people had trusted her vision. When she saw me, she stopped mid-sentence. For a split second, something like fear crossed her face. Then it vanished, replaced by that familiar smile. The one that never reached her eyes. She walked toward me like we were about to have a friendly chat. She told me she wanted to talk. She said we'd both been victims of misunderstandings. She said lawyers were escalating things unnecessarily. She said this could all be resolved if I stopped pushing. I asked her why she'd forged documents. Her smile cracked. She said that was an accusation. She said I should be careful. She said stress made people imagine things. She said Mark had misinterpreted what he saw. I told her Mark had submitted sworn statements. That did it. Her voice rose. She accused me of orchestrating a smear campaign. She accused me of turning neighbors against her. She accused me of trying to dismantle the HOA from the inside. Each accusation came faster than the last, like if she said enough of them, one might stick. One of the board members tried to calm her. She snapped at him. The other took a step back, physically distancing himself like he didn't want to be caught in the splash zone. I reminded her she was suspended. I reminded her she wasn't authorized to speak for the HOA. I reminded her she was standing on private property. She laughed and told me suspension was temporary. She told me power didn't disappear just because people pretended it did. She told me she still had supporters. That was when a sheriff's deputy pulled up. Not for her. For the board. They were there to serve subpoenas related to HOA financial records and communications. The timing was almost cinematic. The deputy stepped out, clipboard in hand, and asked for the board president by name. Karen froze. The deputy didn't acknowledge her at all. Watching her be ignored was almost worse for her than being arrested. The board members accepted the documents with tight expressions. One of them avoided eye contact with Karen entirely. The other glanced at her, then looked away like he'd just realized how close he'd come to being collateral damage. Karen demanded to know what this was about. The deputy told her it didn't concern her. He told her she was no longer listed as an officer. Her face went red. She told him that was incorrect. She told him she was still in charge. She told him he needed to get his information straight. The deputy asked her to step back. She didn't. That was when he warned her. She did step back then, but she didn't stop talking. She accused the board of conspiring with me. She accused them of fraud. She accused them of cowardice. She promised lawsuits. She promised exposure. The deputy finished his job and left. The board members followed him to their cars, not saying a word to Karen as they went. She stood there alone, breathing hard, fists clenched. For a moment, I thought she might finally realize what she'd done. Instead, she turned on me again. She told me I'd ruined her life over a strip of water. She told me none of this would have happened if I'd just shared. She told me I was selfish, greedy, and obsessed with control. I told her she'd listed property she didn't own. She screamed. Not yelled. Screamed. A raw sound that didn't fit the suburban backdrop at all. Neighbors came out of their houses. Phones appeared. Curtains twitched. She accused me of baiting her. She accused me of trapping her. She said I'd set her up from the beginning. She said I wanted her humiliated. I didn't deny it. I told her she had humiliated herself. That was when she lunged. Not at me exactly, but toward the fence, hand outstretched like she could still grab something and claim it. The motion was sloppy, fueled by rage more than intention. She tripped. The fall was sudden and undignified. She hit the ground hard, her sunglasses skidding across the pavement. The silence afterward was absolute. She lay there for a second, stunned. Then she started crying. Loud, theatrical sobs that echoed off the houses. She told anyone listening that she'd been attacked. She said she'd been pushed. 3 cameras had caught the whole thing. When the second patrol car arrived, the officers didn't even ask me what happened. They watched the footage. They helped her up. They warned her. They also told her to stay away from my property. As they drove her home, still ranting, I felt something shift again. Not relief. Not victory. Certainty. Karen wasn't spiraling anymore. She was desperate. And desperate people make mistakes that leave trails. I went inside and checked my email. The HOA attorney had sent a message marked urgent. They wanted to talk about settlement. I smiled, because I finally understood something they hadn't yet. This was no longer about calming things down. This was about accountability. The settlement meeting was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon, which felt appropriate. Nothing dramatic ever starts on a Tuesday. It just quietly decides to ruin someone's week. The HOA's attorney suggested a neutral location, a conference room at a mediation office downtown. I agreed, mostly because I wanted everything documented. Karen wasn't invited. That alone told me how far things had shifted. A month earlier, she would have insisted on sitting at the head of the table. Now they were pretending she'd never existed. I arrived early and chose a seat with my back to the window. Old habit. The attorney arrived next, followed by 2 board members. They looked exhausted. Not angry, not defensive. Just worn down by the realization that they'd let the wrong person run their community. They opened with apologies. Not personal ones. Institutional ones. Carefully worded statements about regret and oversight. They acknowledged that the HOA had no legal claim to my waterfront. They acknowledged that the listing should never have happened. They acknowledged that Karen had acted outside her authority. They wanted this to go away. I let them talk. They offered to formally recognize my property boundaries. They offered to pay my legal expenses. They offered to issue a written apology to residents clarifying the misunderstanding. They offered to amend the HOA bylaws to prevent future incidents. All reasonable. All insufficient. I asked them what they planned to do about Karen. The room went quiet. The attorney cleared his throat and said personnel matters were complicated. He said investigations were ongoing. He said the board was cooperating fully. I told him cooperation wasn't accountability. I slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies of the forged authorization letter, the fake HOA seal, Mark's sworn statement, and the county clerk's note denying reclassification. I told them I was prepared to let this play out publicly. I told them I had no intention of settling quietly while someone who committed fraud walked away with a slap on the wrist. One of the board members rubbed his face with both hands. He said they hadn't known. He said Karen had always handled property matters. He said they trusted her. I believed him. That didn't make it better. I told them I wasn't interested in money. That surprised them. I told them I wanted 3 things. I wanted the HOA to formally report Karen's actions to the State Real Estate Commission. I wanted them to revoke her membership privileges permanently. And I wanted a recorded statement from the board admitting the HOA had attempted to sell land it did not own. The attorney tried to negotiate. He said the 3rd request would expose them to liability. I said the liability already existed. I said honesty was cheaper than denial. They asked for time. I gave them 48 hours. When I got home, Karen was waiting. Not on my property. She'd learned that lesson. She stood across the street, arms folded, watching my driveway like a sentry guarding nothing. When I stepped out of my car, she called my name like we were old friends. She told me she'd heard about the meeting. She told me the board was panicking. She told me I was pushing too hard. She said I'd get nothing if I kept escalating. I told her she wasn't part of this anymore. She laughed, brittle and forced. She told me I was wrong. She told me the board needed her. She told me she had leverage. Then she said something she shouldn't have. She said she'd only listed the waterfront because she knew the board would never approve it if she asked. She said she'd planned to fix the paperwork afterward. She said it was just a shortcut. I stared at her. I asked her if she'd like to repeat that. She realized what she'd done too late. Her eyes widened just a fraction. She recovered quickly, claiming she'd been speaking hypothetically, that I was twisting her words. I told her I had the conversation recorded. That wasn't a lie. I'd learned to record every interaction with her months ago. For the first time since this started, she looked genuinely afraid. She told me I was ruining her reputation. She told me no one would ever trust her again. She told me I was cruel. I told her actions had consequences. She called me heartless. She called me vindictive. She called me obsessed. Then she threatened me. She said she knew people. She said accidents happened. She said maybe my dock would have an unfortunate fire. She said it softly, like she was sharing a secret. I called the police. Again. This time, they didn't just warn her. They documented everything. They told her to leave. They told her further contact would result in charges. She left screaming. The next day, the HOA board emailed me. They agreed to all 3 demands. They also attached something extra. A copy of a complaint they'd filed with the state, detailing Karen's actions in their own word. I sat on my dock that evening, listening to the water lap against the posts, knowing this had crossed a line no one could erase. Karen had stopped being a problem for the HOA. She was about to become a problem for the law. The investigation moved faster once Karen stopped being protected by polite silence. 2 days after the HOA filed their complaint, I got a call from a state investigator. He introduced himself, confirmed my name, and asked if I was willing to provide documentation and testimony related to a fraudulent property listing and misuse of HOA authority. His tone wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. He spoke the way people do when the facts already line up. I told him yes. He asked if I felt safe. That question landed harder than I expected. Until that moment, I'd been operating on adrenaline and principle. Hearing it framed as safety snapped things into focus. I told him about the threats. I told him about the recording. I told him about the repeated attempts to access my land. He asked me to email everything. I spent the rest of the morning organizing files, audio recordings, emails, screenshot, camera footage, the forged letter, the fake seal. The timeline practically built itself. Once you stop trying to explain someone's behavior and just document it, patterns become obvious. Karen's pattern was control first, paperwork later. By the afternoon, unmarked cars started appearing in the neighborhood. They didn't park directly outside my house. They didn't announce themselves. They just existed, quietly watching. That alone was enough to rattle people. Neighbors who had been whispering suddenly found reasons to be elsewhere. The sidewalk emptied. Curtains closed. The HOA sent another email urging residents to cooperate with authorities. That word. Authorities. They hadn't used it before. Karen did. She left me a voicemail that night. 3 minutes long. Rambling. Angry. She accused me of turning her into a criminal. She said the state was overreacting. She said she'd been trying to help the community. She said I'd regret this. I saved it. Then I blocked her number. The next morning, Mark called again. He sounded relieved, almost upbeat. He told me the brokerage had terminated their relationship with Karen entirely. He told me their internal compliance team had flagged her conduct as egregious. He told me they were cooperating fully with investigators. He also told me something else. He said Karen had tried to list another property. Not mine. Someone else's backyard that happened to border the same water. The listing never went live. Compliance caught it, but the attempt alone spoke volumes. Even after everything, she still believed she could outrun consequences. That was the day the warrant was issued. I didn't see it happen, but the footage made its way to me by nightfall. A neighbor's security camera caught Karen being escorted out of her house by 2 officers. She wasn't cuffed at first. She was arguing, pointing, performing. Then she resisted. The cuffs came out. This time, there was no buyer watching. No audience she could charm. Just flashing lights and the slow, unavoidable gravity of reality. Charges were announced that evening. Fraud. Forgery. Criminal misrepresentation. Attempted grand theft. Each one felt surreal to read, like they belonged to someone else's story. But they didn't. They belonged to the woman who thought authority could replace ownership. The HOA board called an emergency town hall the next night. Attendance was mandatory. They said it twice in the email, bolded, underlined, like they were afraid people would pretend nothing was happening. The room was packed. I sat in the back and listened as the board explained what they'd known and when. They admitted they'd failed to supervise Karen. They admitted they'd allowed her too much unilateral control. They admitted the HOA's credibility was damaged. Then someone asked about the waterfront. The board president cleared his throat and said, clearly, for the record, that the land was privately owned and always had been. He said the HOA had no claim. He said any prior statements suggesting otherwise were false. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. After the meeting, people approached me. Some apologized. Some avoided eye contact. A few thanked me quietly. One man admitted he'd almost believed Karen when she said I was hiding something. I told him she'd been very convincing. That night, I walked the shoreline alone. The water was calm, reflecting the lights from houses that suddenly felt farther away than they ever had before. For the first time since this started, the land felt like mine again. Not just legally, but emotionally. Karen was out on bail 2 days later. I knew because she violated the no-contact order within an hour. She didn't come near me. She didn't call. She posted a long rant on social media about corruption, betrayal, and power abuse. She named no names, but everyone knew. She claimed she was being silenced. She claimed the HOA was scapegoating her. She claimed I'd manipulated the system. Comments turned against her faster than she could delete them. Screenshots spread. Investigators noticed. Her attorney contacted mine that evening, asking if I'd be willing to consider a plea agreement that included restitution and a civil settlement. I told my attorney I wasn't interested in negotiating yet. I wanted to see it through. Because Karen had finally learned something important. The rules she'd been enforcing on everyone else were real. And now they applied to her. By the time Karen's trial date was set, the neighborhood had split into 2 very quiet camps. There were the people who pretended nothing had happened, who waved a little too stiffly and avoided eye contact like guilt might be contagious. Then there were the ones who suddenly wanted to talk, to ask questions, to fill in the gaps they'd ignored while Karen was in charge. They'd all lived under her rule. They just hadn't realized how fragile it was. The court process moved slower than the fallout. Depositions came first. I sat in a small, windowless room across from Karen for the first time since her arrest. She wore a blazer that was supposed to signal professionalism, but her hands betrayed her. They never stopped moving, tapping the table, twisting a pen, tugging at her sleeves. She didn't look at me until she had to. Her attorney asked her questions that sounded soft but carried weight. About the listing. About the authorization letter. About the seal. About the money trail. Each answer tightened the noose a little more. She tried to explain. She tried to justify. She tried to turn intent into accident. Then my attorney played the recording. Her voice filled the room, calm and confident, explaining how she'd listed the waterfront without approval and planned to fix the paperwork afterward. The sound of her own certainty coming back at her made her flinch. She shook her head, muttering that it was taken out of context. No one agreed. When it was my turn to testify, I kept it simple. I described the property. I described the listing. I described the buyer standing on my dock. I described the threats. I didn't embellish. I didn't editorialize. I just told the story exactly as it happened. Facts don't need drama. Outside the courthouse, Karen finally broke. She cornered me near the elevators, ignoring her attorney's warning. She told me this had gone too far. She told me she was facing real prison time. She told me I could still fix this. I told her I wasn't the one who broke it. She accused me of enjoying this. She said I liked watching her fall. She said I'd always resented her power. I told her I'd never wanted her power. I just wanted her off my land. She laughed, a thin, hollow sound, and said I was lying. The trial itself lasted 3 days. The prosecution laid out the paper trail. The forged documents. The email instructions to the broker. The attempted second listing. The threats. The recordings. The jury watched Karen's confidence crumble piece by piece. Her defense tried to paint her as overzealous but well-meaning. They said she was passionate about community resources. They said she'd misunderstood her authority. They said she never intended to steal. Then Mark testified. He described being shown documents that didn't exist. He described wiring a deposit he'd been told was legitimate. He described realizing, too late, that he'd been manipulated by someone who spoke like authority made truth optional. The jury didn't need long. The verdict came back guilty on all major counts. Karen didn't scream this time. She didn't argue. She just stared straight ahead as the judge read the charges aloud. Fraud. Forgery. Criminal misrepresentation. Attempted grand theft. Sentencing was set for a later date, but the damage was already done. The HOA moved quickly after that. Karen's membership was terminated permanently. Her access privileges were revoked. Her name was removed from all records. The board voted to dissolve and reconstitute the HOA entirely, rewriting bylaws from scratch under external supervision. They invited me to attend the meeting. I declined. Some victories don't need witnesses. The night before sentencing, Karen tried one last move. She had her attorney send over a proposed civil settlement. Full restitution. A public apology. A request that I support leniency at sentencing. I read it twice. Then I declined. Because this was never about money. It was about the line she thought didn't exist. On the morning of sentencing, the lake was perfectly still. I stood on my dock and watched the fog lift off the water, revealing the same shoreline she'd tried to sell like it was hers to give away. I didn't go to court. I didn't need to. Whatever happened next, Karen would finally understand something she'd refused to learn her entire tenure. Power borrowed without permission always comes due. And the bill never goes to someone else. I found out Karen had been sentenced while I was repairing a loose plank on the dock. It felt fitting. My phone buzzed against the wood, vibrating itself closer to the edge, and for a second I considered letting it fall into the water. I already knew what it would say. Still, I picked it up. 18 months. Suspended sentence, probation, restitution, a permanent ban from holding any HOA or board position in the state, and a criminal record that would follow her into every background check, Every application, every attempt to reclaim authority she no longer deserved. She wouldn't go to prison. She would go nowhere. That, I realized, was worse for someone like her. The HOA sent one final email that afternoon. A long one. Apologetic. Transparent. They acknowledged failures, outlined reforms, and formally confirmed, for the third time, that my waterfront was private property with no shared access now or ever. They thanked residents for their patience and cooperation. Karen's name appeared once. In past tense. Life didn't snap back to normal after that. It eased into something quieter, something steadier. Neighbors stopped whispering. People started waving again, real waves this time, not the stiff, guilty kind. A few even apologized without being prompted. I accepted them all. Holding grudges felt pointless once the truth had settled. Mark sent me a message a week later. He'd bought a different lake house, one with clear boundaries and no HOA in sight. He said he still told the story sometimes, usually when people didn't believe that something like that could happen. He thanked me again for stopping him from making the worst purchase of his life. I told him he'd paid in stress instead of money. He said that was still too expensive. The dock stayed exactly as it was. No new signs. No gates. No dramatic gestures. Just wood, water, and a shoreline that finally felt peaceful again. The cameras stayed up, but they became background noise like insurance you hope never to need. Karen never contacted me again. I heard things, of course. Everyone did. That she'd moved. That she blamed everyone but herself. That she still told people she'd been wronged. That she couldn't understand how it had all slipped away so fast. I understood. She'd built her power on assumption. On people not checking. On silence and discomfort and the belief that authority, once claimed loudly enough, became real. It worked, right up until it didn't. One evening, weeks later, I sat at the end of the dock and watched the sun sink into the water, the sky streaked orange and pink like it was putting on a show just for me. The lake was empty. No voices. No footstep. No one measuring anything that didn't belong to them. I thought about that first morning, about standing there with my coffee while a stranger admired my property like it was already his. I thought about how close I'd come to losing something that mattered, not because of a legal loophole, but because someone had decided rules were optional. People like Karen don't believe they're villains. They believe they're entitled to shape the world into something that suits them, and they're shocked when it pushes back. The world had pushed back this time. Quietly. Firmly. Permanently. I stood up, tightened the last screw in the loose plank, and walked back toward the house as the light faded. Behind me, the water lapped gently against the dock, exactly where it had always been. Right where it belonged.